Hi everyone. We're going to start in a couple of minutes. Just waiting for everyone to join in. Guys, there's also a poll. Here you might see it in your bottom bar. You can take this poll while you're listening to the webinar. Just some fun questions around API security. It's API scanning and DAST actually.
I mean, even that first question unveils the complexity of how people even think about API testing. Like, if you ever want a fun time, you can go on the DevSecOps Reddit and just like search for API testing and then see how people are doing all sorts of different, more or less manual things.
Yeah, I'm a stalker there. I'm always there, so I know
Well, I feel
exactly.
like it's all vendors.
Yeah,
Like
it
every
is.
vendor is stalking, waiting for someone to say, "Hey, does anybody know a good solution for this?" And then just 20 comments of
Yeah.
like,
Hi,
"Yeah,
we
so
do it, we do it, we do it.
yes, we're actually the best." Like, wow, amazing.
Yeah, I know. It's funny too. Reddit is generally funny, but so there's some gossip also over there in API scanning, DevSecOps space. So it's pretty cool.
Yep, for sure.
All right, I think we can start. Yeah, so I'm just going to write in the chat. There's polls. Yeah, so there's polls for anyone who wants to answer these questions, fun questions. Um, General guidelines, guys, keep it interactive. Ask as many questions as you want. We'll try to answer in the chat or after the whole session is over. It's like a 40 to 45 minutes webinar. So we'll spend last 5 to 10 minutes on Q&A. Ask any questions around API scanning, DAST, API security, otherwise DevSecOps as well. James is somebody who has deep knowledge in DevSecOps. So yeah, ask away. Okay, let me just share my screen and we can get started. Okay. All right, guys. Quick look at the agenda. It's the topic of the webinar is API scanner versus DAST, and how AppSec teams are thinking about these two in today's time in 2025. So this is the agenda. We'll go over, what is a traditional DAST, what are its limitations, how does modern API scanner works, some checklist, and we'll talk about how to choose between these two options. Both are relevant, but how do you choose between these two options, right? Little bit on Akto as well, on how we are doing API scanning. So let's get into this. Yeah, again, chat with us, engage, ask questions. There's chat over here. There's also something called as Q&A in the Zoom chat, Zoom webinars thing. So uh, ask any question that you have. Our guest over here, so some introduction over here. James, we've known for more than 1.5 years. I think we had our first call with James when he was at PagerDuty. He was a security engineer there, and he's now working at Latio Tech as the industry analyst who's giving a very unbiased opinion about DevSecOps, right? DevSecOps space to the
Yes, I think they're heavily biased. They're just not paid for. They're not financially biased. But I
DevSecOps.
definitely have strong opinions on all this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and really, the most relevant background is ReliaQuest was an early adopter of GraphQL and microservice architecture in Kubernetes, and so like I was, right there with like, hey, this DAS scan is just not doing anything.
Yeah.
Um, so it was fun exploring all of those early API securities and how they're evolving. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, great to have you here, James. I mean, I consume your content a lot, and we get a lot of knowledge from that, right? Like just outside API security as well. You talk about CSPM and a lot of other things in DevSecOps space. So yeah, for the audience over here, if you have any questions around DevSecOps, not just API security, feel free to ask. Obviously, ask questions on DAST and API scanning. But James has very, very good depth of knowledge in this space, so please ask away all the questions. All right, so who am I? I am the co-founder and CEO of Akto. I'm yeah. So who is Akto, by the way? So Akto is an API security platform in DevSecOps. Is the one of the fastest growing AppSec platform, I would say, in the space. We build enterprise grade API security program for all the modern AppSec teams. We've been around for 3 years. We are headquartered in San Francisco, and we have built a modern API scanner, which we would love to show you. And we have a lot of opinion on what you should choose in terms of your API scanning strategy, DAST versus a modern API scanner. And this webinar is going to be all about it. Okay, so to start with, some context on what is a traditional DAST, right? And I'll give some context and then we'll ask James his opinion on traditional DAST. So DAST, in simple terms, is black box testing. Fundamentally, it means running testing applications in a running state. This is what defines DAST, right? Black box, simulate real attacks, really very good at finding XSS, injection, those kind of vulnerabilities. You This is how actually it works. You basically provide a URL. It will try to scan all your web applications with the URL that you've provided and gives you a report with findings such as XSS, as I said, injection, SQL, those kind of findings. It's very good at those things. And yeah, so as I mentioned, XSS, SQL injection, CSRF, right? These are things, these are success stories for DAST. So it's been great for traditional web scanning in the past. I think one of the most popular open source DAST since 20 years now is Zap proxy. Everyone knows it. Everyone loves it. There's like huge following of Zap. I think every organization we talk to, they've at some point used Zap in their environment, right, for web scanning. So that's one example of a DAST, a traditional DAST, but there are many today in the world. So James, for you now, I've given a little bit of context, but I think you know this a lot more than I do. Tell us more about the definition of a traditional DAST. What does the traditional DAST mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's really I think of it primarily as like web crawling followed by fuzzing,
Mm-hmm.
where it's just enumerating all the URLs it can find and then trying to inject all of the forms that it can find.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it really worked okay for monolithic web architectures, particularly. Um, and so I think that's why there was so much adoption on it. And even I think it's interesting because it's somewhat popular in like the marketing-y space to say that DAST is dead. And I think that got popularized because of the shift to API driven architectures. And people didn't realize like that's why your DAST isn't helpful anymore, is because this isn't how your web apps work anymore. Um, but all that to say, uh, DAST is still very appealing to most people because it's by far the easiest security testing to set up, where you just give it a URL and then it starts doing its thing. But the flip side to that is it goes from the easiest thing to set up to the hardest thing to set up in like 5 seconds, because then you need to start providing an auth token. And depending on how you do like auth is, in my opinion, the most difficult part of any web app. And for the security team, who's already sort of like not deeply ingrained with development teams, doesn't naturally understand a lot of like the architecture, you're asking them to go from the easiest thing to the hardest thing just to get like decent results out of a tool. Um, and so I think that's part of the difficulties in implementing DAST at scale. But then, particularly, uh, a lot of the bigger providers, like Zap is definitely a great open source option, but then a lot of DAST sort of became this commoditized add-on to things like Tenable and Qualys, where it's like this cheap plug-in thing where they're just hoping that you expand into the rest of their platforms. And I'm allowed to say these things
Yeah.
because yeah. And the it's a difficult it's just difficult to get value out of. And I think really I view API security then as it's really the evolution of DAST in that it just works for modern web architectures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with you, James. And you've touched on really good points that we'll flesh out on, right? Like we'll go into the depth of it. So, you mentioned something that DAST is meant for monolithic architecture, not for microservices, right? So exactly the point. So today, the applications are moving towards microservices architecture. It's not moving; it's actually most of them have moved. And
Well,
yeah,
I think even what's so fascinating about this is a lot of people might think they don't need this because maybe they're using like Django or Rails or something.
yeah,
But even the way people are using those is more of a middleware API, anyways. And so even the monolith designs are getting more into this because it like so if you want to do good front end work, so much of like JavaScript architecture has moved towards an assumption that you're making queries to an API backend, that it's almost impossible to avoid if you're going to do like a heavy JavaScript front end. It's only so long before you're going to transition to a totally API driven backend as opposed to trying to scale out like a hybrid monolith with it.
yeah, yeah, exactly, right. I mean, so we get these questions a lot that, hey, can you do our web app scanning? And at the end of the day, I mean, for us also, um, it's APIs at the end of the day. As long as, it's not HTML, it's JSON payload,
Yeah.
it's all APIs, API driven, right? So uh, that's where modern applications are. In fact, I'll tell you a story. 2 weeks ago, I was talking to a team, an AppSec team, and I generally I'll just ask these kind of questions, right? Like, what's your top initiative this year? Not just for AppSec, just generally application team. So their top initiative was actually to modernize their tech, and it's a big enterprise we're talking about.
Well,
So
that's I hear that. I just got back from a checkpoints conference and a couple of the like every CISO, we're modernizing our security program. It's like, okay, that could mean a lot of things.
yeah, yeah, it can mean a lot of things, but generally, like when you think about this, right? Tech is moving at a very fast pace. People are adopting AI left, right, and center. All the large enterprises are, which means you need modern applications, modern tech to support it, right? AI will
Yeah.
not work with the old architecture, old
Well,
way.
I'm fundamentally at a point where like if there's a if a product was built pre-cloud, I can just assume it's going to sort of be a mess.
Yeah,
Because typically the answer for those companies is to acquire someone who was cloud native and then sort of jam it into the platform in a weird way. And it creates such a disjointed user experience that I mean, it's one of the things I try to help security buyers understand is that it seems we all want simplicity, and it seems like for simplicity we should get an all-in-one platform tool, but we're actually creating a ton of complexity
yeah,
because it's a fake platform that's really just like five different solutions under the same URL, and we're just creating incumbent difficulty for later on when we realize like, hey, we should have
yeah.
gone with something that's more helpful.
Yeah, no, exactly. And yeah, in coming back to the monolithic architecture and the why DAST doesn't work for microservices. So what are the limitations of DAST? DAST actually is very good for the older apps, monolithic apps, and where you wanted to find more vulnerabilities of injection, etc. But here are the limitations. It lacks a lot of context. It does not have context of APIs. Anything around how APIs inputs are going into the output of, so output of one API is going into the input of other APIs, and so on. you mentioned something about token authentication testing, right? Authentication and authorization testing is the hardest with DAST. So the simplest ones are so simple to do that people love it. The harder ones are
Yeah.
so hard to do that it doesn't give value,
Well,
right?
it's I think of it as either Selenium is going to work for you and things will be okay, or it's gonna like, or you're in the jot with mandatory one-time password like nightmare zone of trying to set up a DAS with that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that this is what we hear all the time, right? Like especially GraphQL, gRPC, those APIs, the modern APIs, those are very hard to test with
Well,
that.
that I ultimately I tend to think in terms of like what data do these tools have access to, and that can kind of tell you, even if they wanted to make some of these solutions, what can they do? And if a company has built a purely outside in DAS scanning tool, that fundamentally they do not have the context they need.
Yeah,
Because if you don't have a public introspection URL for GraphQL or public API docs, like they literally cannot get your schema and
yeah,
create relevant tests. I mean, this was one of with GraphQL, this is massive. I please, if you're here and you're using a DAS, like look at the logs of the test that is happening. Do not just look at the findings, because when I was running DAST for that GraphQL app, it's injecting fuzzing payloads. Every single one of them is failing and getting rejected because it's not in the right schema. And so you're just running this giant scanner that's literally doing nothing. It's just, if the schema is, if every call has to use a simple example, will be in like curly brace URL colon whatever, and then
yeah,
like data colon SQL, right? Just to make it like super vulnerable. And then and curly brace, like that, you could have the most glaring SQL injection on the face of the planet, but your DAS tool is just going to be sitting there shoving like SQL injection payloads that's just not in the right schema, and so it's all going to get rejected. And so you're just creating noise um, for zero benefit.
yeah. Agreed. Yeah, and exactly what we hear from all our conversations also, right? Like they all have DAST program, and because it's important, right? It's a traditional program that everyone will have. But if you ask about the vulnerabilities it's showing, it's literally zero. Right? So uh,
Yeah, or it's showing like header vulnerabilities that aren't even. It's like me. Okay, great. We don't have secure cookies enforced. Like, okay,
yeah,
great.
yeah, and I think yeah, that's exactly what it is, right? There are blind spots, so it will show you good SQL or injection or cross-site scripting, those vulnerabilities. But when it comes to all of these context,
Well,
contextual vulnerabilities like BOLA authentication, authorization, mass assignment, it's very hard for a DAS tool to be able to find those. Yeah,
well,
James.
that's I even separate this out as like I think this is like advanced API security. I don't think traditional DAST, if we're talking about like those guys, I don't think they even do like SQL injection, cross-site scripting very well because they're not injecting relevant payloads at all. But
Yeah,
then the stuff you're talking about is only possible with like much more advanced. It gets to the way you guys approach things in terms of seeing the interconnectivity of the application. And Bola is if you look at like the OWASP top 10 for API security, um, it is mostly authentication mistakes.
yeah,
And it's so contextual that no SAST is helping you find these.
yeah,
Um, because I have a demo like video game API that I use for testing security tools. And like it's just to make the point that if it's an application where someone needs to be a paid user to access sales data, a SaaS tool can't know that that's the intended functionality. It's only if you're looking at active traffic and application relationships that you can see, oh, hey, every person who's hit this API has been authed in a certain way. And all of a sudden we've seen that you can actually hit it unauthed as well. And
yeah.
then that's a potential security vulnerability. But I think this even requires like another layer of API security testing complexity
Yeah,
to
so
look
I
for.
think what you're talking about is there's traditional DAST, there's DAST, or maybe some API scanner, and then there's a modern API scanner or contextual API scanner, if I can say that. So there are three over here. But you're so right, James. I think the reason we're talking about all of these, right, BOLA, authentication flaws, or anything in the OWASP API top 10 is around authentication because um, if I talk about all the conversations I have with the AppSec teams these days, and I ask them, it's an unbiased question. I ask them, hey, what do you find as vulnerabilities these days in your applications? And they say we find injection and all, and that's fine. That we can have a control on. It's not a big problem, but we are never able to find, in an automated way, access control issues, BOLA issues, authentication issues. It's only when some incident happens we get to know of it. So that's the state. So what teams are really looking for is an automated, scalable way. I don't think 100% automation is possible, but how can you scale it? How can you scale it and maybe bring some automation to all of those vulnerabilities, right? That's where we are at. That's where I feel most of the conversation is these days.
Yep. And that's we got a question here from Cam or Cammed. And he said, since DAST creates a lot of traffic in the network, are there an efficient way DAST can be improved and how the API scanner will improve on the traffic that is generated on the network? And I think this is definitely something where a lot of teams have, I guess everywhere I've worked has had like some sort of warning to the development teams, like, hey, the DAST scan is kicking off. And I think there's different flavors of API security testing out there. And I think all of them solve different parts of this problem in their own way. But I think part of the evolution from DAST, because DAST is just pure fuzzing, pray and spray, like hope you get something relevant. But if you're using like an API testing solution that's mostly built around like in pipeline testing, the fix is that it's more targeted testing. Like it's fuzzing the schema for specific attacks based on like a specific scoped endpoint. Or if you're using something that's looking at traffic more in line, that's where it's like there is no or there's very limited additional like test generation. But I'm sure you can speak well to how you've managed the.
Yeah. So for the question, I think your question is how the API scanners will improve on the traffic that is generated on the network. Um, to remove the noise, right? So actually, I can't talk about all the API scanners, but the way to do that, the way to reduce the noise in API traffic is you don't take the bad traffic. Of course, you will receive all the bad traffic also, but you tune it to only show in the dashboard or only test the good traffic. And there's a way to do that in Akto, but I don't know about other API scanners. But you definitely don't want your API scanning payloads to be polluted with noise, with bad traffic. So that should already be built in your API scanners.
Well, that's yeah. I was gonna say I'm curious how Acto has approached the like traffic problem that comes with, hey, we know we want to test this API for different potential issues,
Yeah,
but we
no,
don't want to
we'll
cause
go
big.
into the demo of it, and we can show you all of that. So that's
Cool.
those things should be taken care of, cared by the API scanners anyway.
Yep.
Okay, so we talked about DAST. We have not talked about much, the modern API scanners. Why are they different? What are they actually? So let's talk about API scanners. Uh, what are API scanners? And I'll give my definition, and James, maybe you can give the layers of definition that you just brought in. Our definition for modern API scanner is it's able to detect vulnerabilities of in APIs in all the OWASP API top 10, right? Now, how to do it is this. For a modern API scanner, it should be able to actually analyze the traffic, get the traffic, analyze the traffic, replay the traffic, test for vulnerabilities, and then give you a report in CI/CD. So this part is fairly easy, but doing this part is where the context comes in, the understanding how APIs are talking to each other to actually find vulnerabilities in authentication and authorization and BFLA and all of those things. That's not possible if you don't have the traffic information. Even if you provide a Swagger file, so we have a strong opinion there that you do not provide a Swagger file for testing, and though we allow for it, but it will not give you the context. It's still a documentation. It will not give you the context of how APIs are talking to each other. You will not have the traffic values. How will you replay and actually get the payload information in response? So just coming back to this, modern API scanner is, it will be context aware. It will be able to do active scanning. It will be able to do all the OWASP API top 10, including BOLA, BFLA, which people shy away from and say that, hey, we do OWASP API top 10, but actually they don't do BOLA and access control and all of that. So this is what you want in a modern API scanner. And the difference, right? The DAST and API scanner. Actually, before that, maybe James, your definition of modern API scanner.
Yeah, I think it's there are a lot of different approaches to this problem that are out there. And I think everyone is very convictional about the approach that they took.
Yeah.
And the real answer is that there's just trade-offs, right? Uh First, there's this bucket of like people who built runtime API security testing tools that are trying to get into testing, and they certainly have access to this data. But just from what I've seen, it's like very not they're still building out the testing would be a good way to put it. And then people who the downside of this approach is that it's not always super easy to get that traffic to a third party platform to do the analysis.
Yeah.
And so other people have tried to find ways to short circuit that. But to what you alluded to, ultimately it comes down to you have to feed it a schema somehow. And that's going to be easier or harder for certain companies depending on their environments and sizes and all of that. Like if you have an application that's all built in a single way, it might not be that hard to like turn on GraphQL introspection in a staging cluster and then send that to a scanner that runs in pipeline or something. It'll still be complicated because then you have to like deal with auth and all of that. But it's just a different approach to the same problem, and ultimately the network stuff is the source of truth. And so
Yeah. There's trade-off. I know what you're saying, James, exactly, right? Like the thing that I'm talking about is harder to deploy, harder to do, harder to get traffic. Definitely hard. But the other way of importing a Swagger file, in our opinion, has, and we've done that. We show those vulnerabilities also. The difference between the vulnerabilities we find using the Swagger versus not using the Swagger and traffic is vast.
yeah,
So once you show it to the org, they are pretty okay actually doing the network traffic thing.
well, it's even like it ties in well with what Matlub just asked in terms of he said I never vote for DAST in my org, so in my view, IAST or RASP does a better job than any DAST. And to me, it's part of that trade-off. Like if you put a RASP in code, like yeah, it's going to have more context than even the network log. Like you're going to see function testing and stuff, but like that has performance and implementation trade-offs that are real problems too. And that's why I think we want to try to simplify like Gartner Magic Quadrants tend to do of like, here's the best one in the top right. And the answer is really like, well, it depends on one of the first questions I ask when people ask me like, what DAST should I get is like, how much do you actually want to care about DAST?
Yeah.
Like some companies just want to check the box,
Yeah.
cheap, outside scan, zero actual value thing. And that's fine. But it's all a question of trade-offs in your architecture to figure out what the best kind of fit is going to be.
Agreed. No, 100% agree. If you're okay with, I think a check, then sure. Like I think the traditional DAST also works, and just like importing a Swagger file also works. But maybe 2 years later, if you want actual API scanner, or like find vulnerabilities, then maybe you want a much better approach. So that's the difference between a DAST and an API scanner. Really, the architecture focus, as we said, is for DAST it's monolithic. For API scanner, it's microservices. Scanning approach, this is a big difference. For at least in our definition, it's black box testing, as James also mentioned. For API scanning, it's the API documentation, the APIs, the traffic. So that's context aware scanning. That's not black box. Coverage, this is more HTML based web apps. This one is more all the APIs, REST, GraphQL, SOAP, gRPC, all the complex APIs architecture. And yeah, other things, right? Vulnerabilities, focus. It's more BOLA, authentication. This is more injection. Authentication support is a big one, which James mentioned. It's very hard to do that in DAST, but you can totally do it in modern API scanner. You can completely automate the token fetching process for RBAC testing, access control testing. So yeah, so these are the main sort of differences between the traditional DAST and modern API scanners. Um, just yeah, so I think coming back to and I think James, you have asked this question. There are some questions that people have asked which can be solved using, just showing you the demo of it. What does Akto do? And we are in the Akto webinar, so let's talk about what Akto does for modern API scanning. Um, Everything that we've talked about in terms of modern API scanning, real-time traffic monitoring, taking the traffic, replaying it for testing and finding vulnerabilities in under the OWASP API top 10 and more. Um, Context-aware API scanning, obviously, because we have the traffic. Um, yeah, detecting using actually AI-powered test library. Um,
Well,
CI/CD integration is a normal one. Yes, James.
one thing we didn't talk about specifically in the context of having the network traffic, I mean, the major benefit is how much easier it can make the auth process, because you can just capture live traffic and replay with that existing traffic. And so it's while it is harder to get that traffic set up in the first place, it can ultimately save a lot of time. uh, Basically what I'm saying is don't buy a DAST until you do an authenticated scan, because you will learn that sales cycle is about to go from like 2 weeks to 6 months as you try to set that up. So
100% agree, James. And we'll see this now in action, the whole automation, because that's something that we talk about all the time. And Acto has done a wonderful job there. So let's see how you can do the modern API scanning with Acto. So let me just show you what we have. Sorry. Um, Okay, so and Acto does a lot, right? Acto does is a complete API security platform, but I'll just show you the scanning part. Quick demo, not a huge demo, but let's see. Let's go to the API collection that we have. By the way, so Acto takes all the APIs from API traffic through its 50 plus traffic connectors in the screen. So if you want to get network traffic using daemon set, eBPF, gateways, or any of the cloud connectors, you can do that. Once you do that, you will start seeing all the API traffic over here. There's no import of OpenAPI spec file here. It's all coming from traffic. Though you can import from OpenAPI spec file also, by the way. We have all
well,
of this.
that's
Yeah.
I think this capability is super important for like bigger enterprises. And this is what I was alluding to, where like um if you have like a small perfect CI/CD architecture, you might already be able to have a good sense of all your endpoints. But you hit a certain point where it's like you've got enough developers doing stuff of different seniorities and different architectures and languages. Like they are not all going to be using a standardized like API doc generation mechanism. So
Not at all, James. What we encounter is in just a very recent conversation I was having with one of the teams. They said they have about 500 API endpoints, and that person himself, he went to the engineering team, asked them to give the API endpoints. The engineering manager took about like 3 hours, produced a 300 API endpoints Swagger file just for him, and that was only one application.
yeah.
So basically the documentation that you have that you're very confident of is actually only probably 10-20% of your API
No,
endpoints.
that's I asked our when I was first going down the GraphQL scanning route and I didn't know any of this stuff. I asked our engineer for like, can I have our GraphQL schema? And he was like, sure. And it was like a week later, hey, I got some of them. It's like, okay, yeah.
Yeah. You're asking devs to give you API documentation, which they also don't have, right? That's not something they're doing every
Yeah.
day. So you don't have to go to the devs for API documentation here in case of Acto. You can just get the traffic, get your API collection. This is one of the services that we have. I won't go into the discovery bit. I'll just show you how testing is done actually. So because we have all the API traffic, just to give you a glimpse of, the traffic that we get some sample values, and you don't really have to deploy in your production. You can totally deploy in your dev environment or a staging environment, which is lower environment, very much easier for you to get access to and do the testing in. So you can get traffic from there, get all the sample values, uh, and click on run test. Now this is where things become interesting. All the test categories that you see over here are OWASP API top 10, and in fact more. These are not 10, these are like some 20 categories, sans 20, 25 also. The interesting thing over here is we have the largest API security test library, and this is also a big difference between DAST and API scanners. Especially with Acto, we've taken a lot of time into building that test library. We have 1,000+ test cases, all curated in-house with a lot of research, lot of understanding all of those security vulnerabilities out there, and all of these are evolving almost every week. We are improving them, adding to them. So that's like 60 bola you will not find anywhere, or 138 broken authentication.
Well, I
Absolutely.
think a lot of people don't, a lot of other vendors in this space don't want to make rules for it. And so they rely on these like sloppy ML uh, things
Yeah.
that just create so much false positive because it's not every user has the same access and is accessing the same stuff every day, and so it's so hard for people who don't want to write actual rules to try to like fake a lot of the bola capabilities.
You're so right. Yeah. I mean, it's not possible that we've done that hard work, so we can tell you it's not possible to do it just using AI, or, just like writing some very basic rules. We also tried that, didn't work. We are doing the thing that actually gives value, which is really writing your own rules. Yeah. So just in terms of scanning, you can run tests with all of these options daily, continuously once. I'll just say daily. I'll say 7 a.m. in the morning. There are there's a test role option, which is you can select a test role that I have added in my dashboard. You can add your own. So maybe I'll select attacker token. I'll click on run daily, and that's it. All the results will be, I'm sorry, here in the in this tab in the CI/CD run. I'm showing you one of the CI/CD runs for the just for the demo. All the vulnerabilities are here, and I want to show you one of the vulnerabilities that Acto has discovered, which is where you will understand why traffic is more important for Acto. So in the values tab, what Acto has done is replayed the traffic, replayed the request. It replayed this request for the JWT none algo, changed the auth token from bearer to JWT none algo, found 200 OK in the response, plus a lot of good data. We didn't just look at 200 OK, we actually compared the response, and which can only be done if you have values, if you have traffic. You can't do it otherwise. So that prevents a lot of false positive. Now, because of which we marked it as vulnerable, and
Well,
that's it.
that's it's worth even highlighting. Like a lot of other people rely on both the response codes or like timing differences,
Yeah,
and that creates most false positives that I've seen. Is like staging environments are usually not reliable enough to have standard timing, and so
yeah.
using timing is all over the place. And then access codes are always such a hilarious uh, thing. They are almost never doing the expected response.
Nobody is following this. No dev is following this.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the larger companies, no dev is following the 200 OK or 4XX, any of these. So for us, it was very important to look at this actually. And that's why like traffic is so important. You can't do this, right? Changing the bearer token to JWT none algo and not doing any of those configuration. Acto itself being able to do this or in an automated way. It's extremely, it's not possible with Swagger also. So that's what traffic helps us with. Now, in terms of test roles, because you highlighted, James, this as a very important thing, right? How do you automate token? Sorry, one second. Yeah. So with Dash, the big important thing is you can't really automate token fetching process. access control, BOLA, vulnerability detection is almost absent. So one big problem that teams have is they have tokens with short expiry expected, right? So hard-coded token will not work. So how do you automate token when it's behind SSO or Okta or social login, or if it has MFA, complex MFA, right? You can do that with Akto through this automation called login step builder or JSON recording. What it does is, with any of these options, any complexity that you have in terms of fetching the tokens, you can add those API call steps over here. I can add as many steps as I want. If your token is coming after a series of API calls, you can completely automate this, get the value over here, extract the value, save it. Once you save it for this particular role, every time you are doing RBAC testing for this role with this role, you will not have to supply the token. It will completely automate this token fetching process, no matter what you're using, MFA, SSO, Okta. We've done all that automation for multiple
Yeah.
companies.
And that's most other tools that aren't built like from the ground up for API testing will instead have you like maybe they can do one post request and then that's it. Or rely on like Selenium scripting if you have a login page. But
Yeah.
that's where like a lot of API architectures require a more complex login series of handoffs like this.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, James. And this is something that I've seen a lot of DAST tools, API scanning tools. Nobody has this level of automation that we do. And this really solves your access control issues. Imagine a SaaS applications having 100 plus permissions and roles, right? Not possible to automate unless you're able to do this. So you can have like hundreds of roles, and that's also automated, by the way, for your ad back testing. Anyway, so the 2 minute demo has become more than 5 minutes demo. I'll go back um, to the webinar and the important talking topic that we were discussing, which is DAST versus modern API scanners. Um, we have about 5-10 minutes, so I'll try to wrap up. But what is the checklist to select modern API scanners? And this is big checklist. I will not go into this, but James, if you have to talk about, maybe your uh, top five, let's say top five in the list, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, since I talk to a lot of vendors, like there's just little things that I look for to pretty quickly tell me like how
Yeah.
sophisticated people are on some of this stuff. Like one is GraphQL support is like an easy, even if you don't use GraphQL, if someone supports GraphQL,
Mhm.
it tells you that they support like ingesting and understanding API endpoints, putting relevant findings in relevant fields, and not just doing this like dumb mass fuzzing thing. Um, and then the second thing I look for is just the approach that the vendor's taking. Like if it's a network log based approach, I have a good idea of what sorts of capabilities will be there versus if it's looking at the either generating API docs based on static code analysis or um, doing scanning more locally that way. Uh, or if it's more of like the CI/CD testing or some different outside in, like really how the testing is set up is going to tell you a lot. Um, and then yeah, the Bola support. Like, Bola is such a hard thing to
Yeah.
it's a hard thing to evaluate at a high level because no vendor is going to say like, oh, we don't support Bola. Like they're all gonna say yes, we do it. And it's unfortunately it's the hardest thing that you can't really test it without setting up an auth user to get an idea of what you're gonna see from it. Um, so I think that it's a very difficult trade off to at least just be aware of that everyone's going to say they're doing it, and you're only going to really know if you test it. And so, uh, yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's a super easy solution to that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, James, I think very good points, right? GraphQL support is the number one, according to you, if you're looking for a modern API
Just
scanner.
because it tells you, yeah, I mean, it's not even if you don't use it again, it's just because it tells you there's a certain level of sophistication that the vendor's able to do with API testing.
Mhm.
Whereas a lot of other people who like maybe they're DAST and they're transitioning in the API testing, or they have some very like low version of it, like they're only going to have basic REST support, because you can crawl a RESTful API very similarly to a web app, where
Mhm.
you're just like hitting all the endpoints, looking at what comes back, and then shoving different headers in. And so the REST APIs people are going to fake, but you can't really fake GraphQL support that way. And that's why I just look at it as like a key indicator of the sophistication of the DAST solution.
Yeah. Yeah, GraphQL is special in a way that of course, for discovery also, you don't need actually traffic discovery for GraphQL. You have introspection, right? So you will be able to get all the GraphQL API endpoints, though the traffic will be missing there. But that's one way it's special. The other way is also actually the GraphQL vulnerabilities are also different, James.
Yep.
So we have a separate library which is just dedicated for GraphQL. Think
That's
mass assignment.
You're reminding me of a DAST evaluation I did where they said they had GraphQL support, and that support was actually one rule that just said like introspection was turned on or off. And the finding was like if it was turned on, it was a security finding. Um, and so it's another thing to
Yeah.
be aware of.
Yeah, but you're bringing a very good point, right? It's hard. It's hard to do GraphQL testing. So it's if you're looking for a modern API scanner, you really and you have GraphQL APIs. If you don't have GraphQL APIs, obviously don't care about it. But if you have GraphQL API endpoints, it's very important to ask those questions that what all GraphQL vulnerabilities do you support? Because GraphQL has very separate way of working, right? So your mass assignment, for example, is very different for GraphQL. I remember one of our engineers took like 3 weeks to do the very massive mass assignment GraphQL vulnerability testing, and now we support it. But it's hard. GraphQL is definitely hard, and so is gRPC. By the way, if you have gRPC, then you're very modern API scanner, I guess.
Well, yeah, I
Um,
mean that's really what I'm saying is like if anyone is every vendor who says they support gRPC, it's just like a level of sophistication that
yeah.
you can tell they care about APIs and not just like, oh, we're a DAS scanner and now we say we do API stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and the second point which you mentioned, I want to touch upon this, right? So, how do you detect BOLA in especially the trials? How do you even
Yep.
say you can detect BOLA? Um, just just our story, you won't believe every single POC we have done, we've detected BOLAs. I'm not kidding. Our engineers can talk if they're on the webinar. It's because of the automation that we have. So it's definitely the hardest, but if you find Bola, your POC is successful.
Yep. I mean, it's just the majority of true positives because like so many app frameworks now handle stuff like SQL injection for you. Like you have to go out of your way to hard code a SQL injection if you're using like an API framework when you're creating stuff. And so really it's around not carefully thinking through the permissions model, because it's such a like I'm sure all of us have used like the different feature flag monitoring softwares out there and the different like ways to handle user permissioning groups. Like that stuff is a nightmarish mess. And like I've seen everyone from like low level product managers who manage like the entire like who has permissions to what, to like architects who do it. Like there's also not a clear owner in most orgs for like who's even keeping track of like what accounts have access to what features and how do we know what who can access what. And that's where um Bola comes in.
Yeah, 100%. And for SaaS application, it becomes even harder, right? You've worked in SaaS application for
Yep.
SaaS applications, and for SaaS applications, you have hundreds plus permissions, as you said, feature flags and stuff like that. And there's no product manager or developer who knows all those 100 permissions. So it's very hard, and that's where traffic actually comes in, James. You can create an access control matrix because you have the traffic information, which permissions are accessed by which API, and so on. Anyway, it's because it's lot of deep discussion on the authorization, but just to conclude, yeah, I think this is a good slide to conclude on. But guys, this is what we have in terms of just what we discussed. Traditional DAST, right? What is traditional DAST? How the world is moving to modern API scanners. what's really a modern API scanner. If you're thinking of implementing modern API scanner, what should be that checklist? How should you even think about this? So that's really the crux of the discussion, and we'll have this webinar recording uploaded on the website also. But for now, any questions that anyone has that we can answer?
Well, while we wait for questions, another complaint that I have about other vendors came to mind around like a lot of existing API security vendors that do the runtime stuff. The way they do testing is creating like Swagger files based on the traffic they're seeing,
Yeah,
and then testing those files anyways. And so it's a weird, like, even though they have access to the runtime data, they're not actually using it for
yeah,
the testing piece of it.
yeah.
um
Because it's
yeah.
hard, James. It's hard to.
Yes. Yeah,
So it's easier to say a check that hey we do it than build it actually. So I mean yeah, I have a lot of opinion there, but uh, if you are looking for modern API scanning, I think the checklist that he mentioned is very good. Like right, look for those signs. I guess we don't have more questions here. People are probably happy with the webinar, so they don't have questions.
we'll
uh,
assume.
yeah, we'll assume that. But good stuff, James. I think we can conclude this. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. It's wonderful having that discussion with you, and I think I would love to have more discussion around product security. Right, so you have such depth of knowledge. I want to pick on different other topics as well.
Of course, anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Yep, see you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Bye.